The Arrma Nero was one of the most innovative and controversial RC cars to ever hit the market, and today I'm going to tell you its story, so sit back, relax, this is going to be an interesting one. We've got a clean, fully functional example of the Arrma Nero here, and today we're going to do a full teardown of it, see how it bashes, and I'm going to tell you how Traxxas almost killed Arrma using this car. The story of the Arrma Nero starts way back in 2009 with a little company called Team Durango. They made race cars, and in 2011, they created an offshoot for bashing known as Arrma. For the first couple years, they released some fairly generic bashers, but then in 2014, they released the first version of the Kraton. The Kraton was based on the DEX-8, which was a race car by Team Durango. And if you look at the DEX-8, you'll see that it bears more than a passing resemblance even to today's modern Arrma Kraton. In 2015, Hobbyco acquired Team Durango and Arrma, and then in 2016, this Arrma Nero was announced. This thing was a wild departure from anything they'd made previously and had a ton of really cool features. We're gonna dig into these cool features as we tear this thing apart, but suffice to say, some of these features are what caused Traxxas to sue Hobbyco. First thing we're gonna have to do to take a closer look at this is remove the skid plates. Interestingly, these had two skid plate options. This one was supposedly designed for better cooling, and this one was designed for better ground clearance. Practically speaking, from what I've heard, there wasn't a lot of difference though. Now, you might not know this, but Traxxas actually sued Hobbyco for several different patent infringements. There's one that most people know about, but a few others that you might not be aware of. And one of those is right under this cover. By the time Team Durango and Arrma came into existence, Traxxas had been making patents for over 20 years. And unfortunately for Arrma and Hobbyco, one of those patents was a centrally located steering system that used a linkage to a turnbuckle to turn the steering. On this car, this was a pretty innovative system because you could actually reach through that skid plate and adjust the servo saver, but Traxxas did not like this. Now that we've got this skid plate off, you can also see the servo in here, as well as the twin vertical plate main chassis rails, a center differential which hides one of the coolest party pieces of this car, some really cool universal joint front and rear drive shafts, and a big beefy 6S motor. While we're down here, I can show you one of the things that Traxxas didn't sue Arrma for, and that's these really cool bottom-loading battery trays. These are pretty neat. They've got lots of space in them. Each one's designed to hold a 3S battery, and they've got really convenient buttons to open them up. Now, even though these battery trays weren't part of the lawsuit, they might look somewhat familiar to you. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But first, let's pull this front differential out, and I'll show you one of the most innovative parts of this car. While we're doing that, let's talk a little bit about the history of Traxxas and lawsuits. This is not the first time, nor was it the last time that Traxxas sued a company for infringing on one of their patents. Traxxas has many patents, as you can see here, and they've been suing companies over them for a long time. For instance, way back in 2014, they sued HPI for infringement on a waterproof battery box, which is a pretty interesting patent that not only applies to this lawsuit, but applies to a lot of the vehicles you see and use today. Traxxas won that dispute with HPI, and that dispute was actually one of the things that nearly put HPI out of business, but keep in mind, HPI was already in trouble before that lawsuit happened. And that's going to be a common theme here in this story. Now, if you've ever worked on one of the cars that Traxxas actually held a lot of these patents for, you're about to understand one of the reasons why Traxxas might not have liked this car as competition. And that is that this car has a fairly easy to access differential system. Before we remove this differential, we need to disconnect a servo cable, which is something you won't have to do on most bashers. However, once we do that, this entire differential module pulls right out the front. And the reason we had to disconnect the servo cable is because this is a selectable locking differential. They have this in the front, rear, and center. This was known as diff brain, and it was an available feature on the Nero. You could get it with or without the diff brain. The ones with the diff brain have a blue body, and the ones without it have a green body. However, it was a standard feature on both the Phazon Truggy and the Big Rock Monster Truck that were basically the same vehicle with a few different options. The Big Rock had some beefed up drivetrain components. I'm not sure if the Phazon did or not. Let me know down in the comments if you do know. Pulling this module apart not only gives us a first look at some pretty beefy looking differentials, but at that shift servo and shifting mechanism. Let's take a closer look. Now, we do need to be careful with all of this because this is an old car and a lot of these things are not readily available anymore, but we can see a little shift fork here on a tiny little servo, and then the shift mechanism itself with some pins that go into the differential. Let's see how that works. Pulling this apart, we can see one of the main disadvantages of this differential style, and that is that this is not a sealed differential because those pins go through the bottom. There is a gasket here, but unfortunately you are stuck with just having this be grease filled. And we're running into one of the perils of working on old cars. This gasket really did not want to come off. Let's pull the internals out of this thing and see how it works. That's fairly normal looking so far. Some really nasty old grease here. Okay, now we can see how the party piece of this system works. Basically, we've got holes in this side gear, and when we shift into locking the differential, these pins go into the holes and they lock that side gear against the housing, essentially stopping the internal differential from working and locking the system up. All right, I'm gonna get this all cleaned up, get this put back together, then we'll move on to the electronics where the next patent issue occurred. Make sure you stick around to the end of the video because this story might not have the ending you expect. Now it's time to talk about the elephant in the room, that's right, the receiver box. Because unfortunately for Arrma, years before this truck was made, Traxxas had patented the box with a gasket. Now, of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that. What they really patented was a box with a gasket and a clamping design that sealed against water for the wires coming through, kind of like what you see here. Should Traxxas have been able to patent something like that? We're going to talk a little bit more about patent law in a few minutes, but for now, let's take a closer look at these electronics. We've got a receiver in here, and then we've got the rest of the party piece. This is the diff brain itself. It takes a signal from the receiver and sends it out to the 3 different shift servos, front, rear, and center. Controlling those, we have a modified version of the tactic transmitter. This has an extra knob on top that allows you to select all differentials unlocked, center differential locked, center and rear, and then all 3 differentials locked. Each one of these settings allows for a different type of driving with this, which we're going to take a look at in a few minutes when we bash it. And by the way, it's this part of the lawsuit why we don't see more cars with waterproof receiver boxes. This is a pretty obvious design, and Traxxas has a patent on it. Behind the ESC and receiver, we have the big motor, as well as a center differential and slipper clutch. You can see the adjustment for the slipper clutch right here. Everything's kind of buried in there, and that center differential is almost identical to the front and rear differentials, so we're not going to pull that apart. And powering all that is the BLX 200 ESC, which is essentially a Max 8 with a worse switch. Before we go out and see if this truck's actually any good, we need to do something about this body because it is by far the worst part of this truck. In order to fully understand how this patent lawsuit went down, we need to talk about a few basics with patent law in the United States. There are 2 main types of patents in the United States: utility patents and design patents. A utility patent is basically a patent on how something works, and a design patent is a patent on how something looks. And Traxxas cited both of these types of patents in this lawsuit. In order for a patent to be considered valid in the United States, it has to meet some criteria. One of those criteria is that the patented item can't be something that's obvious. So you can't patent a color, you can't patent a basic idea that anybody could easily come up with. It has to be a unique concept that's worthy of being patented, essentially. And before 2013 in the United States, when the patents that Traxxas is using in this lawsuit were created, you had to be the first person to come up with the idea. That's something that's kind of interesting that we'll talk about a little bit more, because some of these ideas might be considered unique, but that's something that would really be up for debate depending on what you consider the idea to be. For instance, with that battery box, is it enough of a unique design to have a box with a seal that some wires go through? Is that not an obvious design? Well, unfortunately, that is decided by the person that reviews the patent, and those people that review the patents usually have a very short amount of time to review them, and they aren't always well versed in the industry in which the patent is being applied. That means that sometimes patents get awarded where they really probably shouldn't have been, and I think at least one of the patents that's used in this lawsuit falls under that category. Now I'm gonna finish taping this thing up, put some E6000 on it, then we'll talk about that last patent that was infringed on with this truck. The final and most infamous patent that was supposedly violated were these cantilever or pushrod shocks. If you're not familiar with this design, instead of having a shock directly attached to the arm, we have a pushrod with a bell crank that goes back to horizontally mounted shocks. As you can see here, Traxxas patented this design for the Revo. Along with that utility patent, they also had a problem with a design patent that was simply the design of the lay-down shocks like this. So did Traxxas invent this design? Absolutely not. Famous race car designer Gordon Murray is actually credited with creating this design for F1 cars all the way back in 1979. Was Traxxas first to use this design on an RC car? Sort of. Tamiya used a kind of similar design way back in 1984, though it wasn't quite like this. Now that being said, the Traxxas patent describes this type of suspension for model cars. Now is that a valid distinction? Again, I'm not a patent attorney and I'm not sure, but that patent was approved and this design looks identical to that patent. And that's far from the only similarity between this and a Traxxas car. We've got the cantilever suspension, side-mounted batteries, locking differentials, and all that sounds a whole lot like the Traxxas Summit, which came out quite a bit before this Nero did. So what are the advantages of this type of suspension? First of all, we have less unsprung weight. Second of all, we have better tuning capability. And in an RC car, at least, it gets the shocks up out of the way to protect them from dirt and debris. The main disadvantage, of course, is complexity. This is a lot more complex than just having a shock right here. There were a couple of other things that Traxxas was suing Hobbyco for that were related to Andromeda drone. We're not going to get into that right now because it's not related to this car, but just be aware that they did have a couple other patents they had an issue with. I think it's time we see how this thing actually performs. Unfortunately, these stock tires have not survived the years. These foams are completely trashed, so I think it's fitting that we put some of the latest Arrma Kraton tires on here. One more cool design feature I wanted to mention that I don't think I've seen on any other car is that this uses pillow balls for the rear, and it actually uses a 3 pillow ball design in a triangle, which is pretty neat. Now, if you've been enjoying this RC history deep dive, make sure you get subscribed, because I've got some pretty cool old RC cars that we're going to be reviewing in the future, and you're not going to want to miss that. And now the body has cured, and let me tell you guys, if you haven't experienced how much stronger you can make an old body with this cement board Tapin E6000, I definitely recommend giving it a try, because this body now is stronger than a new one. And speaking of strong, let's go see just how tough this truck actually is. I'm really curious to see how the differential locks are going to affect top speed. Let's see how it works with them all open first. Okay, we're definitely spinning the front wheels. Full throttle. That feels reasonably quick. Steering's not the best. Yeah, it's definitely diffing out. Give it one more pass. All right, let's see what that speed is. Okay, 45 miles an hour. Let's lock the center diff and see if it's any better. Okay, it's not diffing out now. That's good. It feels quicker. Oh yeah, she definitely feels faster. Let's bring it in and see how fast that was. All right, 48 miles an hour. So we get 3 extra miles an hour by locking the center differential. Let's see how it affects bashing. Full throttle pull in the sand, all diffs open. Definitely see that front diff out. Lock the center diff, full throttle pull. Oh yeah, that's definitely different. Let's lock all the diffs and see if it feels any different. Woo, that's some serious traction, wow. Okay, let's go just center and rear and see if she can do some drifts. Oh yeah. All unlocked again. Yeah, it really does change the way it feels. Just the center diff. Okay, that's pretty cool. Let's see how this thing actually bashes. All right, so after a couple of packs of what I would consider medium bashing, we did break it. We sheared off one of these drive shaft pins, which I'm told is a fairly common breakage, and keep in mind that was with the center differential lock doing fairly big jumps. We also ripped the actual ESC mount off the chassis. Even with those breakages, this is a really cool car. The locking differentials really change the feel of it, and it almost makes it like it's 4 different cars. It's a reasonably durable platform, especially for a first generation vehicle, and this suspension is super plush. However, this suspension was this truck's downfall. And as you may already know, Arrma lost the lawsuit with Traxxas. In that loss, Hobbyco had to cease production and sales of these and surrender everything to Traxxas for potential destruction. However, it seems like Traxxas decided not to destroy the spare parts because you can still get spare parts for this on Horizon. But the real question is, was this lawsuit responsible for the failure of Hobbyco? And the answer is absolutely not. In Hobbyco's bankruptcy filing, which happened around the same time as the ending of this lawsuit, they listed over $100 million in debt. They owed a lot of money to a lot of people, and they were probably already doomed. However, I will say that it shows a kind of interesting pattern with Traxxas. HPI was in trouble and they sued them. Hobbyco was in trouble and they sued them. And I'm sure those aren't the only two examples. Now, speaking of that, Traxxas has sued a lot of companies over the years. There's the HPI suit, this suit. They sued HBO for the Max name when they changed it from Cinemax. They sued a little ESC company called McLaren Racing because they came up with the M-Max ESC. They've sued Amazon. They've sued New Bright. And I'm sure the list is much longer than that. Those are just some examples that I found with just a few minutes of searching. More recently, they sent cease and desist orders to a bunch of aftermarket manufacturers simply for using their names on their websites. However, Traxxas said that was a mistake. They hired a third-party company to go after some Chinese counterfeiters, and they got a little overzealous. I'll let you decide whether or not to believe that. So here's the thing. Nothing Traxxas has done is really illegal, and it's not even uncommon in industry. However, at least in my research, it's fairly uncommon in this industry, and Traxxas seems to be the only company that is really litigious in this hobby. I'm not going to say whether that's right or wrong. They're within their rights to get patents, and they're within their rights to sue people for violating those patents. However, I don't think it's great for the industry. For instance, this was the first generation of the Nero. Can you imagine where this truck would be if it was in its 6th or 7th generation right now? This thing would be an absolute beast. It's already a really cool truck. Unfortunately, we lost the Nero. Hobbyco went out of business, all their brands were bought by Horizon, and the rest is history. On an interesting side note, Tamiya now has a couple of cars that have this exact same cantilever suspension, and Traxxas hasn't sued them for it, so I'm not exactly sure what criteria they use for suing or not suing companies. Maybe it's only when they feel like companies are in trouble and they can put them out of business. Again, that's just supposition though. I'm not saying one way or another. Let me know down in the comments what you think about all this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Traxxas. Do their business practices prevent you from buying their products? Let's talk about it down in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed for some awesome future videos. Then check out this video where I'm giving away one of these trucks.